Chapter 9. Consider it pure joy. Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. Pure joy. It was the Sunday after the heartbreaking loss of my dad that God brought me back to my childhood church to hear a sermon on the above passage. I admit leaving the church with more questions than when I arrived. I considered dear family and friends who had suffered unimaginable loss. How could it be pure joy for a young mother to lose a child? How could it be pure joy for an active woman to lose her ability to walk in a tragic car accident? How could it be pure joy for a woman to lose a husband or a daughter, to lose a father prematurely? I did not at all understand, yet God was preparing me to experience amazing lessons of trust and faith. And over time, this passage would become one of my very favorites, bringing me great peace time and time again. Though the necessary treatment for the cancer that I had invaded my lungs was decided upon in late 2004, I did not start the experimental chemotherapy treatment until February 2005. Our insurance questioned whether it would cover the experimental trial, which began a battle participated in by multiple family and friends. We were told that to receive the treatment would cost approximately $16,000 every 6 weeks for an indefinite period of time. Phew, we certainly were not going to be able to fund this treatment independently. The entire Milligan clan, as well as my sister and some of her friends, began a political campaign to ensure I would receive this treatment. A close friend from church is a lawyer in the field of healthcare. To be honest, I had never even realized her area of expertise until discussing our situation concerning the insurance questioning our treatment. This amazingly generous and extremely bright woman was quick to offer her services. She spoke to our doctors, the insurance company, and many others, forming an official appeal to the insurance company's questions regarding this treatment. Without a penny billed, she created a 200-page document to support our claim. Wow, this sweet friend had for many years blessed my life and that of my children with her friendship and tender heart. But how could I ever know that the intellectual gifts given to her by God would also be such a great blessing? After 5 weeks and the involvement of several politicians and a few military generals, most specifically Lieutenant General Lennox of West Point, my treatment was approved. The commander of the Keller Army Hospital informed Derek that not one bill would go unpaid. He was reported as saying that one way or another, he would find a way to pay our bills. I was greatly touched by his determination to help me, a woman he has yet to meet. Though we struggled through the military bureaucracy, God also opened our eyes to the kind, generous souls who work within military administration. My chemotherapy treatments began on Derek's 34th birthday, February 9th, 2005. He said that though he hated for me to have to endure the treatments, after all our struggles to be approved for the treatment, it was the best birthday present he had ever received. We were blessed to have my mom, now living in New York, and she was gracious enough to keep the 3 children while Derek and I shared 3 special days in New York City. During the first day, I underwent several tests to prepare for the start of chemotherapy. Derek and I enjoyed a delicious meal at a recommended steakhouse and then treated ourselves to a New York Philharmonic concert. The next morning, I returned to Sloan Kettering for my first full day of chemotherapy. Derek never left my side, and though I became a bit nervous as they inserted the IV before beginning the treatment, I was overwhelmed by a peace assuring me of God's presence. The first drug, irinotenicin, given over 30 minutes, seemed unexpectedly easy. I was cheerful as the injection moved towards completion, my only discomfort a bit of lightheadedness. I smiled at Derek as the nurses removed the empty bag that had held the iratimicin and replaced it with a small bag of anti-nausea medication required before the initiation of the next chemotherapy drug. This bag was equally uneventful. However, as the nurses initiated the next drug, cisplatin, I was overwhelmed by an intense nausea. The room began to spin, and I feared I would fall out of the chair I was sitting in. I called out for something to throw up in, as I knew I would soon lose control of my stomach. A nurse quickly came with some sort of medicine, which she injected into my IV. I quickly felt better, the episode lasting no more than 5 minutes, but the fear it had caused led to tears I had held in for the past 2 days. That extreme nausea was what I had feared about chemotherapy. The stories one hears about chemotherapy is endless vomiting, among other discomforts and humiliations. It was all coming true, I felt sure. Because this treatment was experimental and because everyone reacts differently, the doctors were unsure of how to prepare me. They told me I may experience nausea ranging from mild to severe. I may lose my hair, and I may experience other symptoms from a list seemingly miles long. What I did not realize is that many researchers, doctors, and drug companies are working tirelessly to develop chemo drugs that are as effective against the cancer, but with drastically less severe side effects. I would soon find Mark 16:18 to be my new mantra. And when they drink deadly poison, it will not hurt them. My grandmother, Margaret Scott Grady, the namesake of my youngest child, passed away from lung cancer when I was less than 2 years old. I do not remember her, but I treasure her through the stories told by my father and my grandfather. She fought the cancer for as long as she was able with the chemotherapy drugs of 30 years ago. In one sense, I feel closer to her, knowing we have experienced similar paths. But I also recognize that the passing of time has softened this experience of fighting cancer. Her experience was endless vomiting with little chance of survival. The chemotherapy I have experienced is manageable, even over extended periods of time, and my chance of extended survival is so much greater. The remainder of my morning receiving my first chemotherapy treatment was uneventful. Though minor nausea ensued, Derek and I were still able to enjoy our afternoon break before returning for the last chemotherapy drug. This drug, flavoperidol, was administered over a 4-hour period, so I settled in for a nap in my comfy chair while Derek waited for 4 long hours on the edge of an uncomfortable wooden upright chair, prepared to offer anything that might make my experience more pleasant, not thinking of himself for one moment. Now might be a good time for me to explain what I have noticed about Derek's experience as the caring husband of a woman fighting what has been labeled a terminal cancer. It was appropriate that Derek sat with me in the Keller emergency room as I was told that I had a liver tumor, because he has sat with me through almost every single doctor's appointment since that day. He never left my side as I recovered from liver surgery, first in the hospital for 5 days and then at home for 6 weeks. He never missed an appointment as I waited for scan results, and he researched extensively which doctor we would contact if the cancer resurfaced. When metastases were found, he was ready for the next step, and he drove me to New York City repeatedly to meet with the doctor. I never went alone. He fought mightily for the insurance to approve my only treatment option, never once accepting their rejection. And when my chemotherapy treatment began, he did not miss a treatment until I insisted I was comfortable and prepared to get the treatment without him. Even then, when the treatments became more difficult, he drove to the city every Wednesday night to carry me home. He stayed awake with me the nights I was sick, and he took over all my duties of childcare and household chores, as I recovered from my treatment each week. He did all this while doing his best at his job, and he never once complained about the new life we lived together. He cared for me, he prayed for me, and he always assured me that he would prefer to live this way than to live without me. Through all of this, I realized that he was under extreme pressure from the world. Our well meaning and beloved family and friends would never cease to understand when I was having a rough week or a tired day, but I noticed Derek was rarely allowed this grace. According to the customs of the world, he was to be strong for me. What people did not realize is that my life was a cakewalk compared to his. His shoulders were heavy laden with extra work as he prepared mentally for the possibility of raising 3 children alone, but he never seemed to mind. He is my strength, my inspiration, and my best friend. By the time our first day of chemotherapy was complete, I felt yucky, but only yucky. I could tell Derek was exhausted, though he never admitted that to me. We returned to our hotel for a sound night of rest. I was surprised to wake with terrible night sweats, and the mild but annoying nausea kept me awake most of the rest of the night. I was fascinated by the burning in my abdomen. It was explained to me that the purpose of the chemotherapy was to attack the rapidly growing cancer cells, but the drugs are unable to distinguish between those and the rapidly growing cells of my body, specifically the lining of the stomach and other digestive organs. The discomfort was tolerable and a little interesting for the moment, but I could see how the disturbing sensation could quickly grow old. We returned to the hospital the following morning for some required blood tests, and we then began our trek home. I felt like I was recovering from a nasty flu, but I couldn't help but feel strong and proud. We did it. We had survived chemotherapy, and it was not terrible, nearly as terrible as I had anticipated. During the months after chemo began, I realized that the few days after treatment, when I felt physically bad, I would struggle mightily with my thoughts. I suppose I have always believed in spiritual warfare, but I have never before recognized it in my own life. I knew in my mind that God had not and would never desert me, but my thoughts continued to beat me down. Why are you putting yourself through these treatments? You're going to die anyway. God is not here with you. He does not care. He allowed you to suffer with this cancer. He will take you from your children. I could barely drag myself out of bed these days, not because of my physical pain, but because my struggle against these thoughts of fear and defeat was physically exhausting. I soon realized through the reading of scripture that these thoughts could be spiritual warfare. The book of Job shows us that evil can only do what God allows, no more. God created Satan and the other fallen angels, and therefore they remain under his control. In Job, Satan was forced to ask permission of God before inflicting each act of despair on the faithful man. I read several texts on how to rebuke Satan and his forces, and sure enough, the thoughts and struggles ceased. I have given this struggle over to God, and he has taken it from me. I once read, when Satan knocks, I only need to answer. Jesus, will you get that for me? I love that. Psalm 35 reminds us, weeping may remain for a night, but joy comes with the morning. Derek continued to take me to chemotherapy treatments for about 6 weeks. The greatest problem experienced during that time was that the chemotherapy was lowering my white cell counts, enough that my body was no longer able to fight the drugs, and I was therefore not eligible for treatment. Each week, as I came into the treatment facility on East 53rd Street, blood was immediately taken by my phlebotomist and soon to be friend, David, and it was tested to determine if my body was strong enough to handle the treatment. One would think I would rejoice when I was not allowed treatment, but the trip into the city seemed long for nothing, and we feared, as did the doctors, that skipping weeks to rebuild my body would also allow the cancer to rebuild. The nurses warned me mightily during these weeks when my blood work showed extremely low white cell counts that I was to be extra careful, especially if the children were ill. I was warned that I was extremely susceptible because my body was too weak to fight common illnesses. And for a couple of months, I was extremely careful. However, I soon realized that although the children and Derek suffered occasionally from the usual colds or flus, I had not been ill since before beginning my treatment. Gradually, I stopped worrying about protecting myself during those weeks with low white cell counts, for I understood that God was protecting me. People would laugh at me when I would proclaim, "I can't get sick." But I could not help but praise my God aloud each night that I rocked my little one to sleep as she fought a nasty flu, knowing I was protected by a most merciful God. It was after those first 6 weeks of treatment that I had my first scan, and we were rewarded with no growth of the cancer. By that time, we were in a routine, and I, for the most part, knew what to expect. I knew that though Derek's supervisors at work had been so generous in making arrangements for him to always accompany me for my treatments, it could not go on indefinitely. We were told that the chemotherapy would continue for as long as the cancer did not grow, and my body was able to tolerate the treatment. We knew that we needed to make these treatments part of our regular routine. It was Derek's idea to include the children. I think he knew what a blessed time this would be for both me and the children. As we talked further about it, we decided I could bring one child each week to chemotherapy, while the other two stayed with my mom. Rebecca was not yet 3 years old, so we decided it might be a little soon to include her in the rotation. Because the child accompanying me would be alone with me while I received chemotherapy treatments, it was important that I felt sure that the child would listen and obey while I was attached to the IV pole. The first week I went to the city without Derek, Ashley accompanied me. I was concerned about how it would work out, but by the end of the day, I was praising God for the blessing of this time alone with my oldest child. It occurred to me that as a homeschooling mom, I was rarely with just one child, and what a blessing to have this one-on-one time with each of my children. We began our adventure on the train, where Ashley stared out the window in awe for an hour. We arrived at the clinic at about 7:15 a.m., and after Ashley finished her special donut bought from the city bakery across the street, we were able to complete some schoolwork while waiting to meet with the doctor, waiting to hear if my cell counts were high enough for treatment, and waiting for my chemotherapy drugs to be ready. Once we were led back to the chemo suite, Ashley was treated with a movie she had chosen from the library. Each of the chemo suites is private and includes a TV with an attached VCR. Ashley was in bliss. During the 3-hour break, we enjoyed lunch, usually with Ashley's cousin Audra, who worked just across the street. One more amazing blessing. We then set out on some city adventure. Central Park Playground, Central Park Zoo, horse and carriage rides, the American Museum of Natural History, the Manhattan Children's Museum, the Empire State Building, the New York Aquarium, Broadway matinees, and much more. We had so much to choose from and so little time. Thankfully, God gave us 18 months to complete many of these amazing adventures. Upon returning to the clinic, I began the drug that was to be administered over a 4-hour time period. I was concerned that this would be an incredibly boring time for Ashley, but she seemed as happy as ever to watch a second movie and snuggle in with me on my lounging chair. Halfway through the movie, she was fast asleep, and as I began to feel worse and worse, all I could think about was how joyous I felt to have this time holding my sleeping child after a day I knew I would never forget. And I prayed she would never forget it either. The next week was Luke's turn. I was encouraged by the fact that Ashley's visit had not only been a success, but an incredible blessing. However, I feared Luke might be too young at only 4.5. Yet I believed that to see what was happening each week at chemotherapy was healthier for a child than imagining what the doctors might be doing during my mysterious trips to the city. This thought was confirmed in my mind the following year when Rebecca, who had not yet accompanied me to the city, declared when going in to see the pediatrician for a physical, "I don't want to go see the doctors. Doctors make you sick, and the city makes you sick." A few months later, as Rebecca's Aunt Kim was recovering from an illness in the hospital in Florida, Rebecca repeatedly asked if we could visit her aunt. In her confusion, she explained, "If she is in the hospital, she must be in the city." My children watched as I gave blood each morning in the city to test my blood counts to make sure I was strong enough for a chemotherapy treatment. Then they watched while the doctor examined me, never requiring me to undress or change. And they watched while the nurses inserted an IV for the chemotherapy to be injected into my bloodstream. Then they watched while the bags of drugs dripped into my veins, all the while the color draining from my face. At first, they asked many questions, and they quickly made the connections between the drugs and my not feeling well. Soon, my activities were uninteresting, and I'm sure if you were to ask them, they would tell you that chemotherapy treatments are no big deal. I met another mother at Sloan Kettering with children 6 and 12 years of age. She came for her treatments during school hours, and her children did not even know she had cancer. I respect her opinion and admire her courage, but it is my belief that involving my children completely in my treatment helped them to face the fear that may have been overwhelming if secrets had been kept from them with the intention of easing that fear. Luke, an active boy with a sweet heart, found the greatest happiness at Sloan Kettering Memorial Hospital. His excitement began each morning as we traveled into the city by train. He disembarked from the first few rides with a smile, but also with bruises on his forehead. He tended to bump his head against the window each time something interesting passed, and he tried quickly to thrust his head out a closed window to catch another glimpse. Once at the hospital, the doctor encouraged his budding interest in medicine. The nurses gave him unending attention and often special treats of homemade chocolate lollipops, yogurt, and hard candy. A movie was guaranteed in the chemotherapy suite, and a donut was guaranteed for breakfast. And in the summers, ice cream was guaranteed from a truck on the side of the road during our chemotherapy break. What could be better than that? Luke's behavior was absolutely angelic when in the city, and he became surprisingly intuitive about how I was feeling. He was aware that by the end of the day, I did not feel as well as I did when the day began, and he struggled to reconcile this with the excitement he felt to come to the city. He once told our friend and favorite nurse, Tiffany, "I don't want my mom to feel bad, but I hope she has chemotherapy forever." I couldn't help but smile. Part of me felt exactly the same way. The idea of full days of chemotherapy for an undetermined period of time initially seemed unbearable, but God turned these days into some of the most cherished memories with my children. Isaiah 61:3 promises to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. Thank you, Lord. You have given me beauty and gladness, and I cannot help but praise you. It was more than a year before Rebecca was allowed to join me during one of my trips to the city. Each week, she would ask with such hope in her eyes, "Is it my turn?" I would always answer that she was not yet old enough. She never had a tantrum, always accepting this answer with respect and submission, but it broke my heart each time I saw the disappointment in her eyes. When she was 3.5, shortly after the comment that doctors and the city make you sick, I finally decided I was ready to try having her with me in the city. Derek stressed that he did not think she was ready, but I desperately wanted the experience with her that I treasured with the others. Her first trip went well. She was a good listener. She played hard on the Central Park playground, and she slept through most of the last treatment. By this time in the duration of the treatments, this final drug was causing me to sleep as I waited for the treatment to finish, and I slept hard. It was during this regular nap that I awoke to find that Rebecca was no longer next to me. My heart leapt with panic as I jumped from my bed and ran through the chemotherapy ward, dragging my IV pole behind me. I found her at the nurse's station. The look on my face must have revealed that Rebecca was soon to be disciplined, for the nurses quickly jumped to her defense. They explained that she did not leave my room independently, as she was told not to do, but that they had found her quietly awake next to me as I slept, and they had invited her to join them at the nurse's desk. I couldn't help but smile. She was having a ball. Rebecca's second visit was not as smooth as the first. I suppose the awe of the city had worn off, and she was willing to do what was necessary to get her way, which this particular day was to have a tantrum in the chemotherapy suite to avoid leaving me for a lunch outside of the hospital. In an effort to not reward her tantrum, which would undoubtedly ensure more to follow in the future, I was forced to place a screaming child in the arms of our endlessly patient and willing niece, Audra, who carried my youngest daughter, kicking and screaming, down the elevator and out of Memorial Sloan Kettering Hospital to her favorite lunch at McDonald's. As I turned to walk away from the elevator bank with my IV pole being pulled behind me, I listened to my daughter's cries diminish as the elevator descended to the lobby. I said a quick but fervent prayer that her tantrum would quickly cease and Audra's good deed would not be punished. My fears were realized a few minutes later when my friend Shannon, a psychology fellow at the hospital, came in with a smile and a quote, cute story of a little girl outside the hospital who was sitting on the concrete sidewalk crying. She had never met my Rebecca before, and I had little doubt of the identity of the little girl in question. Not one of my finer mommy moments. Though the incident did not last long, it was enough for me to decide that Becca was indeed too young to accompany me to the city. I certainly did not want to in any way disturb the other patients receiving treatment. My disappointment was great, but I did not realize that I was only to receive a couple more of this particular treatment. Particularly during the first few months of chemotherapy, I was entrenched very deeply in the refiner's fire. We were unsure whether or not the treatment would arrest the cancer, and we had little hope that it would decrease the size of the tumors in my lungs and on my heart. It felt as if the treatment might buy me a little extra time, but Dr. Alba Alpha gave us little hope of a cure. I spent any time during these months when I was not caring for the children and when I felt good enough, preparing certain treasures I wanted them to have should I be gone. And I spent much time in prayer for their future should they grow up without a mother. Since their conception, I have fought to care for them in such an intentional way as to not wound or scar their sweet, impressionable spirits. I accept that there will be actions I unknowingly take that will have a negative effect on my children in the future. How can there not be? In this way, I depend on prayer to give me peace in my actions and to help guide my steps to do always what is best for my beloved children. However, what can be more scarring to a young child than to lose his or her mother? I was terrified that I was going to cause this incredible detriment to my children's lives, and there was absolutely nothing I could do about it. This alone caused me great concern and bewilderment. However, my desperation during this time in the fire caused me to dive deeper and more fully into the Word of God And this act led to enormous blessings. I believe that while we are in the fire, during our times of greatest struggle, God blesses us greatly, whether we ask for it or not. However, if our hearts are angry towards Him or our circumstances, we are unable to see all that He is bestowing on our lives. And worse, we do not recognize who is granting us these gifts. If our hearts are open to Him, accepting our circumstances, and searching for Him, we will see His hand ever so clearly. We will see every day how He loves us and how He is showering us with His blessings. This will prove to us that we are not being punished and that we are infinitely loved. As I was struggling the most, I would awaken each morning and ask myself excitedly, what will He do for me today? I couldn't wait to see. Often His gifts would be seemingly small, like the traffic on the George Washington Bridge clearing so that I could return home more quickly after a difficult treatment. And some seemed much greater, such as the offering of my aunt and uncle's timeshare apartment in the city on a day when I doubt I could have made it home, or the meals that continued several days a week for more than a year, many from women whom I had never even met. For the multitudes who prepared those meals, I'm ashamed to say I became overwhelmed with keeping track of who brought what blessing. Thank you notes were written far too infrequently. I apologize that I was unable to properly thank you for the incredible gift of a meal shared. It meant more to me and my family than you can know. Not only the meal itself, but the lesson learned by my children that the people of God care for one another, whether or not they are close friends or whether they are strangers. One of my favorite poems, and a favorite of many, is Footprints. However, during a more recent rereading of the poem, I noticed what I believe to be a significant error on the part of the unknown author. Enjoy this poem with me one more time. Footprints in the Sand. One night, a man had a dream. He dreamed he was walking along the beach with the Lord. Across the sky flashed scenes from his life. For each scene, he noticed two sets of footprints in the sand, one belonging to him and the other to the Lord. When the last scene of his life flashed before him, he looked back at the footprints in the sand. He noticed that many times along the path of his life, there were only one set of footprints. He also noticed that it happened at the very lowest and saddest times in his life. This really bothered him, and he questioned the Lord about it. Lord, you said that once I decided to follow you, you'd walk with me all the way. But I have noticed that during the most troublesome times in my life, there is only one set of footprints. I don't understand why, when I needed you most, you would leave me. The Lord replied, my son, my precious child, I love you and I would never leave you. During your times of trial and suffering, when you see only one set of footprints, it was then that I carried you. Can you guess what I would have difficulty with in this poem? I would like to suggest to you that if this man had been truly walking with God during his lifetime, he would never question God's presence during his times of trial. Yes, God most certainly was carrying him during those times in the fire, and every good day to boot. But this man would have been shouting God's praise, knowing it was God's loving arms that were carrying him. There would be no question. When God does something great, such as carrying us during our times of struggle, we cannot help but to worship. Praise God. The true author of Footprints is hotly debated, but many believe it to be a woman named Mary Stevenson. Those who believe in the authenticity of her handwritten copy, dated 1939, attest that it was written by a scarred and abused 14-year-old girl. Clearly, the heart of the author is pure and spirit-filled, and God has gifted her with a great talent for writing poetry that touches the hearts of many. But it makes sense to me that it would be written by such a young girl, one who may have faced terrible heartache, but who thus far has lacked the spiritual maturity to recognize God's loving and steadfast presence during her time of struggle. Other blessings also impacted our lives greatly during our time in the fire. One woman we had not yet previously met came and cleaned our house thoroughly, asking for nothing in return. So many friends were available on a moment's notice to babysit. Cards were sent and prayers were said from all over the world, and a prayer shawl was sent to me by a group of ladies in Atlanta. This special gift still rests on my rocking chair at the end of our bed. Derek's niece worked just across the street from Sloan Kettering and made herself available to take the children to lunch when I was often not up for it. Could that be anything other than the hand of God? Derek's supervisors had such compassion for our situation and ensured he was always available for me when I needed him. Derek's parents flew from Tennessee or Florida whenever they suspected we might need help for a few days. Jill, one of my closest friends, visited every day for months after my initial surgery, wanted to continue to bless our family even after she moved from New York. So she completed our family photo albums from when Derek and I were married until the present. Wow. Jill was assisted by numerous other scrapbookers, all giving their time, talents, and supplies to benefit a woman they had never met. What a blessing to know that these memories have been preserved in such a special and creative way. Another friend has worked tirelessly to research all known treatments for fibrolamellar hepatocellular carcinoma, as well as the availability, side effects, and success of each. Some may think these blessings are just thoughtful gestures or coincidence, but I know with complete certainty that they were God working through these people. And there were so many more. My sister would call every day and more frequently after chemotherapy treatments. If I had a bad week, she was on the first plane to New York. Really, more times than I could count, she flew up on a Tuesday night, spent Wednesday with me and one of my children in the city, and flew back to Florida on Wednesday night. She had commitments at work and at home that prevented her from staying long, but it didn't keep her from coming for the day. I loved those days. And finally, my mother gave up her home, her job, her friends, and her life more than 2,000 miles away to buy a home just down the street so she would always be available during chemotherapy or other medical appointments to care for me and my children when I was unable to do so. What would we have done without her? My head spins when I think of what my mom gave up and what we would have done had she not sacrificed her life as she knew it for ours to remain the same. But the greatest blessing, peace, overwhelming peace, peace not only for my life and how it might be affected by this cancer, but peace for my husband, my children, my mom, and my sister, and my other family. John 14:27 says, Jesus said, "Peace I leave you, my peace I give to you. Not like the world gives do I give to you. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid." And this peace has brought joy like I have never experienced. Yes, it has taken many months, but I am finally learning to consider it pure joy when I experience trials of many kinds. My trials have indeed been pure joy, as the lessons are eternal. God continues to lead me to be mature and complete, lacking in nothing.